On my last few woodworking projects that I'd built, I'd used cherry or maple, and once even used walnut. Now I had an urge to go back to using oak, mostly because I had some oak in my storage locker, and I didn't have a specific plan in mind, but I knew I wanted to make either a dresser or a floor cabinet of some sort, and I also wanted to incorporate some raised panels in it. So I grabbed some 4/4 pieces to get started while I thought about overall dimensions. First, I considered the sides. I knew I would be running the glued up panels through my planer, which has a 12.5-inch maximum width capacity. Then I figured if I added 2 inches on each side for stiles, I'd have a total of 16 inches for a side width. Multiplying 16 by the golden ratio of 1.62 gave me 26 inches, and adding a 1 inch more for a top brought me to a 27-inch overall height, which is about where I wanted to be with the cabinet, whatever it turned out to be. So I used these dimensions to cross-cut the oak planks out in my garage so they'd be easier to handle. Next, I went to the jointer and flattened one side and one edge of each of the boards I had cut. Once I had one side flat on each of the boards, I went to my planer and started planing them on both sides, alternating from one side to the other, until I got down to about 7/8 of an inch thick. Finally, I ripped all the pieces on my table saw, putting the edge that I had flattened against the fence, and then cutting them all to give me the maximum width of a decent lumber that I could get. Once all the boards were planed down to about 7/8, I laid them out side by side and matched up the grain and the color of the wood so that I had kind of a consistent finish for each of the panels. So after that, I ran all of the edges back through the jointer one more time to get a nice tight glue fit between the edges. And then I marked each of the pairs at the joints with tape and a pencil line so that I could use the biscuit joiner to join them together. Finally, I started gluing the pieces together and clamping them to make two separate panel segments. Once the segments dried, I cut them on the table saw to the final length and width, and then ran them through the planer to bring them down to a 3/4 inch thickness. I set up my raised panel router bit in my router table and dialed the RPMs way down on the router. I found I had the best luck passing the workpiece through the table first with the grain, then against the grain. I also took very shallow passes, like a 1/16 of an inch. I put a piece of tape on the panel so that I wouldn't accidentally flip it over during the process. Finally, both panels had the full scallops on front and back and were complete. With the panels completed, I could start on the rails and the stiles now. I'd planed some of the oak down to a 3/4 inch thickness and ripped it to 2-inch width. I started cutting the one side of each piece to give me a finish cut that I could measure from. Since the joints were going to be tongue and groove, I had to include the length of the tongue in my measurements, as well as some clearance space for the panel to fit in the groove that I was going to cut. I set up my dado stack for a 1/4 inch thick in my table saw and then raised it up to a 1/2 inch deep cut. I ran a test piece, but the dado cut that I made was just a little bit too narrow for the panel edge. So I put a piece of tape along my fence, and then I ran another piece through and then flipped it over and cut it from the opposite end, and that worked out to be pretty good. I made the bottom rail 5 inches wide instead of 2 inches, so I could incorporate it into a lower skirt. I drew a curve in CAD that I printed and then cut out into a pattern for the skirt, then traced it on that pattern onto the two lower rails, took it over to the bandsaw and rough cut out the curved shape. Finally, I took it over to the drum sander and smoothed out the curves. Then when I got the curves the way I wanted them, I took my trim router and broke the outside edge of the curve. Next, I trimmed the ends of the rails on the table saw to make tenons. Once all the tenons had been cut in the rails, I started sanding the panel, especially around the edges. It's a lot easier to do that before it's glued together than after. Now it's time for assembly. To allow for expansion, I allowed about a 1/4 inch gap between the edges of the panel and the bottoms of the mortises I put in the rails and stiles. I filled that gap with a couple space balls on each rail and stile. I did a dry fit by assembling all of the components into a complete side wall and then put clamps on it to make sure that once I did start gluing, it was all going to fit together nice and I wouldn't have any problems clamping it. I took it apart and then started putting it back together again, this time gluing the rails and the stiles together, but making sure I didn't get any glue on the panel edges themselves. Once I had it all glued together, I clamped it up tight and let it dry overnight.